Hello, welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Bible Study. We continue in our discussion of First Corinthians and our detailed study going through this book. We're now focusing today on chapter 9, and this is lesson number 14 if you're keeping count. This is a particularly difficult chapter to try to teach anyway and to understand. Some of what Paul has to say here seems to be straightforward. The problem is it's missing some of the key things that you would need to understand probably. And furthermore, in trying to do my job of bringing what the scholars have to say to us, they have very little to say on it. Some of them don't even cover the chapter in their commentaries other than just mentioning it's there. So let's read it and then we'll try to sort out what's there. Reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I am not an apostle to others, at least I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to our food and drink? Do we not have the right to be accompanied by a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no rights to refrain from working for a living? Who at any time pays the expense for doing military service? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock and does not get any of its milk? Do I say this on human authority? Does not the law also say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Or does he not speak entirely for our sake? It was indeed written for our sake. For whoever plows should plow in hope, and whoever threshes should thresh in hope of a share of the crop. If we have someone spiritually good among you, is it too much to be reaped our material benefits? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we still more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the ways of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in what is sacrificed on the altar? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing this so that they may be applied to my case. Indeed, I would rather die than that. No one will deprive me of any ground for boasting. If I proclaim the gospel, this gives me no grounds for boasting, for an obligation is laid on me, and woe to me if I do not proclaim the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward, but if not of my own will, I am entrusted with the commission. What then is my reward? Just this, that in the proclamation I may make the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my rights in the gospel. For though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, so that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, so that I may share it in blessing. Do you not know that in a race the runners all compete, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win it. Athletes exercise self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable one. So I do not run aimlessly, nor do I box as though beating the air, but I punish my body and enslave it, so that after proclaiming to others, I myself should not be disqualified. So, in trying to understand this, what's missing is what triggered these opening questions and the other questions that Paul is asking here of the Corinthians. We find almost no hard clues in the letter itself or elsewhere. Some schools of guess, I would place it at, as well as argument, go along the following 3 or 4 lines. First school of thought is they have been, that is, they, the Corinthians, have been or will soon be asked to contribute financial support to Paul's ministry, maybe even ministry elsewhere, not to them. And that somehow or another, that some of them would add that was tied to his apostleship. Second, his apostleship maybe has been challenged. We know from other books that it clearly was in some form or fashion. And so that maybe that rumor has there, or that has materialized even locally. Third, he is using himself as an example of willpower to back up his claim in the previous chapter. It's related to abstaining from meat and marriage and so forth. In other words, setting up this example that you don't offend anyone by what you do, and you sacrifice yourself for that purpose. Which would be if that be the case, then this is a continuation of chapter 8. And there are some scholars who argue strongly that chapters 8, 9, and 10 probably should be a single chapter. Some few say this is all about freedom. In other words, a totally separate issue. Freedom from what kind of freedom? Freedom from the laws of the Old Testament, or maybe some other totally new topic. There's not many who go in that direction, but there are a few who either tie it in to other things they say, or sort of lay it out there as they believe that's what's going on, especially considering what we'll cover in chapter 10. And for those who do that, they would then argue that his thoughts ended in chapter 8, and that 9 and 10 then are a continuum. There are others, as you may have, there are other ideas, and you may have your own, but none of the above finds strong support among scholars. It's just everybody seems to be all over the board, and most have little to say about this chapter in the compendiums that they write. Others, other than essentially repeating what's there and just changing the words around and so forth. There's very little there to guide you. The best clue that we have of what might be going on, some scholars would point to verse 3, chapter 9, verse 3. This is my defense for those who would examine me, with the idea of extending that meaning, examining me as an apostle. But Paul does not identify whatever this obstacle is or whatever has triggered this, if it's already happened or even if it's what he anticipates is going to happen. That's missing, and it disturbs. Some of the very noted scholars just say this really disturbs us. As we read this, it's clearly as if something has been left out. But all we have to go by is at least the 5 oldest manuscripts that are normally used as references to referee things that have been taken out and so forth. All 5 are consistent in that they don't have it either. So if it did come out, it came out before the oldest manuscripts that have survived. There is a school of argument that a phrase or two, critical phrase or two, have been left out. We do know from Paul's own words elsewhere in 2 Corinthians and in other letters that Paul accepted financial support from other churches. In one place he says, I robbed other churches to serve you Corinthians. In other words, this was part of the deal. So it is troubling, some say, that he has not established a support system among these Corinthians to support the ministry. And that maybe the reason for not doing that is the problem. It's a self-understood problem. It doesn't need to be explained to us because the letter's been written to that audience and they know it, Paul knows it, and enough said. There must have been a very specific obstacle, however, that blocked Paul here. He acts as if that he's doing this out of obligation, but at this and through self-principle rather than some rule of law. But at the same time, as you read this, you can't escape the fact there seems to be something troubling that's driving this. And so in Paul's concept, and he is being all things to all people in this case, but maybe not telling these Corinthians what they really ought to hear relative to whatever the obstacle is. It appears here in Corinth that he did not accept even room and board while serving there as an apostle, nor did Barnabas, as we understand. And of course, he took care of himself by the labor as a tent maker. And so that's the situation. He does give guiding scripture, however, that support of the ministry should be occurring. In other words, a minister should be receiving their due support. A few scholars point out that these Old Testament references to supporting your labor and so forth through the ministry is there for that reason. He's reminding them that under the Jewish system, under the Old Testament rules and so forth, there is no question that this will be established. Paul then turns to his obligation to preach whether he is supported financially or not. Paul was commissioned by God and Christ, he says, so that is who I'm paid by. Which, how is that pay? It's in the form of enslavement to them. Thus, no pay, no financial obligation is demanded. My body suffers. He uses the analogy of an athlete making his body suffer to prepare to win the reward. My body suffers as a prize, as an athlete, he says, preparing to do the job, to run the race, knowing that I receive the imperishable reward rather than the perishable one that the athlete receives as a laurel wreath. A few scholars in their reviews of the chapter remind us that Paul's other churches were mainly founded initially by Jews. That is, these were Jews who adopted Christianity, and in some cases they continued to maintain a very Jewish worship service, and then added Gentiles as time went on to make up the majority. Faithful Jews likely would have established their churches with a financial support system that was very similar to what the synagogues were on. And so there are some scholars who say that's part of what's missing here. There is not this core Jewish group to support Paul and so forth in the system. That these people are essentially coming from pagan culture, and the only thing they have to back up them is what went on in the temple. So the churches became, over time, because the Jews did not continue, that is, new Jews did not continue to be converted to any significant degree, especially in Greece. Several scholars point out that was a real, one of the real stumbling blocks for Paul, was that when he got into that area, it was pretty well all pagans, that the Jews did not convert. So this church in Corinth was essentially a people of Gentile pagan background. This church lacked a Jewish foundation, one scholar says. Moreover, these Corinthians probably had little idea of how to support an evangelist or an apostle, as such financing in their temples, their pagan temples, was handled through a very different system. A system that was sort of touched on in chapter 8, and that is the selling of sacrificial meat. In other words, as we described in chapter 8, large number of animals were slaughtered under a pagan worship system, served at parties and so forth, and the bulk of it was sold to finance the party and the works of the temple. So this question that was asked in chapter 8, several scholars will say they think that is germane to what's going on here, and maybe that is what's going on. That there is objection to using the pagan system to finance the church. Paul doesn't say one way or the other. He says something about eating, but nevertheless, they think that might be some of what's going on. We don't know. That's what's missing here, is Paul doesn't tell us. So Paul first points out that he has the right for support, but equally he has the right to insist upon it not being used. That twist is a real surprise in the debate. Eugene Boren, a disciple scholar on this subject. So it is for his own reasons, Boren says, that he has decided not to accept their support and make tents instead to support himself. Basically, leaving them with the idea that just having the right does not mean you exercise it. Particularly, as Boren points out, this idea that having the right and not using it with the idea that then becomes the moral high ground. Paul tends to clear that up, that does not make it the moral high ground. The moral high ground is not there by just because you have the right and you don't do it. That doesn't make you any better. Your conduct, as Paul says here, should be driven by a higher calling than just individual rights, is the way Fred Craddock says this. And Craddock likes to say this chapter has a lot to do with the moral stands here relative to how you act. So Craddock says your conduct should be driven by a higher calling than just individual rights. In one of his sermons that's been recorded, that is, he says, that's my take on chapter 9. He says this is also chapter 9, he would like to subtitle it as a morality chapter. It's one of the morality chapters, although not so directly identified as such. This is the governing principle for a Christian life. For the sake of the gospel, be willing to enslave yourself, is Paul's message here, according to Craddock. For the sake of the gospel, it is, he says, it's for the sake of the gospel is a good way that he would subtitle, this is Craddock now talking, he would subtitle chapter 8, 9, and 10 as a subsection and refer to it sort of as some moral directives under this idea that for the sake of the gospel, you consider these points that are brought up in 8, 9, and 10. Paul is saying, I preach not for the financial reward to myself, but such was my commission. In other words, preaching the gospel was my commission. That's what I was commissioned for. And I must be faithful to that commission and not be faithful to some sort of financial reward that might benefit me personally. Because I'm indebted to Christ and God, he says, or he implies. So I serve under Christ's law, not the laws of man. And he implies here, and not the law of the Old Testament. Although he was from a Jew, if you read through this. But I am not running aimlessly and boxing at the wind, he says, but clearly aimed at the target in the end, that is, preaching the gospel and guaranteeing, if you will, my word, guaranteeing his own salvation. I wish you well as you try to make sense of this chapter. It's been a tough one to prepare for, and as one scholar tells his students in his writing, something is amiss here. Probably something that Paul's audience knew very well, as did Paul, and therefore he assumed. There was no need of bringing up the issue. They all know what we're talking about. And he says, then another example of how Paul's writings are all situationally dependent. We today, trying to apply them to ourselves, have to be very aware that Paul is writing to a particular situation and circumstances. And this is one of them in chapter 9. Have a good week, good Bible study, and we'll continue on next week, hopefully in chapter 10.